I'd like to explore in my talk some of the linkages between your world of management accounting and my world of investment. In Oscar Wilde's Lady Windermere's Fan, Lord Darlington quips that a cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now, while of course I'm not suggesting that we're all, or hopefully any of us, are cynics, there's a bit of a parallel for us here. There's always a price for shares in companies, apart perhaps from those real moments of crisis. But it's really hard to establish their value, particularly their future value, which of course is what's really interesting. And perhaps it's getting increasingly difficult as well. As a financial crisis obviously dramatically demonstrated, financial models based on regression analysis of the past have their significant limitations when it comes to predicting the future. It's quite an apocryphal story now, but he actually did say it. Goldman's then CFO said during the financial crisis, we were seeing things that were 25 standard deviation moves several days in a row. Just how unlikely is a 25 sigma event, even one of them? The numbers are pretty hard to contemplate. You might be better at that than I am. A 7 sigma event apparently corresponds to a frequency of 1 day every 3.1 billion years, which is quite a long time. A 25 sigma event, it's sort of the mind boggles a bit. And remember, Goldman's then CFO referred to several of them over several days in a row. It would be sort of like winning the lottery 21 or 22 times in a row, which would be sort of the opposite of what happened in the financial crisis, really. Of course, my point here is that his instinct was not to suggest that the models were wrong, but instead to talk about the events in terms of the probabilities calculated by the models. And I think they were bound to be wrong, since they depended on extrapolating the past. The fact is that things change. We know they change, and they can change in a very big way and in very many aspects of our lives. But the fact is that the speed of change is accelerating, and that leaves businesses that fail to look forwards for dust. So, for example, whatever you think of Uber, the meteoric pace of its rise has been nothing short of breathtaking. It swept through established players. In last year, it was accounting for about 15% of paid car rides in the States, and now that number is around 15%. And of course, there are very many similar examples of such dramatic transformational change. Often people now casually drop in the word disruption into the conversation just to make it sort of seem, I think, a little less unsettling. But when we look at Amazon, Airbnb, Spotify, there's some of the most obvious examples of companies demonstrating that there isn't necessarily a link between what's made you successful in the past as the future. And of course, as the Internet of Things spreads, the implications for business model innovations are absolutely huge, and with a growing gulf between the winners and the losers. The Internet's already had a pretty much life-changing impact on the availability of information. One of the things that I really thought was very spot on in your GMAPS report was the reference to Google's Eric Schmidt when he claimed, I'm not quite sure if it's completely true or how you would prove it, but he suggested that society now creates as much new information every 2 days as it did from the dawn of civilization to 2003. And of course, Mark Carney, Bank of England governor, has recently highlighted issues related to another huge transformation with far-reaching and frankly mostly unknown and unknowable implications, climate change. And there, a broad range of company valuations are significantly exposed. The numbers, again, are very stark. Fossil fuel reserves, the ones that we know about, of energy and mining companies alone, around the world, they total more than 6 times the amount of carbon that can be emitted between now and 2050 if we're to have an 80% chance of meeting the global goal of restricting temperature rises to only 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that gives obvious rise to the threat or the risk of stranded assets, frankly, that cannot be used for economic benefit. And to give some sense of the scale again, the point here is to just talk about the scale of things. 19% of FTSE companies are in the natural resource and extraction sectors, further 11% by value in power utilities, chemicals, constructions and industrial goods sector. And that's a similar pattern across the globe. These two groups of companies account for around 1/3 of both equity and fixed income assets worldwide. But even, of course, if the consensus is converging around the scientific thinking about climate change, debate rages over the timing of the financial risks, another big uncertainty that we all have to cope with. as we, certainly at Newton, attempt to evaluate companies that are either directly or indirectly exposed to those risks. Insurance companies have already had to deal with the real implications of climate change. Weather-related losses have increased fivefold since the 1980s. But of course, it's not at all clear or even knowable when the financial risks will affect the impact evaluations of energy companies themselves. Now, I think Mark Carney's speech and its warnings are both insightful and a motif for the difficulties that many established actors, many of us, business leaders and those trying to assess the value of companies, face in trying to come to terms with the multiple transformations of our time. Bloomberg New Energy Finance Chairman Michael Liebrecht echoed the need for a new thinking in a recent, I think, quite brilliant article when he noted that the future system is going to be more open, more accountable, more answerable to the community, and more socially inclusive. Now, he was referring to clean energy, but frankly, I think those words could apply to politics, diversity, financial markets, media and technology, and yes, to the way we evaluate companies. Whatever happens from here, as Albert Einstein put it, we simply can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. Filling out these gaps, the gaps that we have, I mean, a lot of gaps in the established valuation methods, and incrementally adapting past business models obviously isn't enough. We're not going to work things out. We're not going to be able to take advantage of and avoid being obliterated by new opportunities. And today's companies, investors, and management accountants need to fundamentally rethink orthodoxies about value creation and value capture. Now, that was all the kind of scary stuff where we don't know where we're going. There's no need for any kind of complete sense of helplessness or a sense of chaos in the face of these multiple uncertainties, I think. Instead, I guess we need to just acknowledge the uncertainties and need a robust and consistent framework that's meaningful but high level enough to allow scope for radical changes from time to time in the specifics of how we approach, solve for, or integrate a new development. And that's where a principles-based framework like the Global Management Accounting Principles that you have created, I think is absolutely spot on. We can't create, there's no point sort of trying, and in fact it's fooling ourselves to think we can, a future-proof set of detailed rules, but we can develop a framework for analysis that recognises change as a constant, and therefore, and this is my main point really, that judgment is required.